Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Hey everyone, it's Foxx from ModelMaking.guru here. Hello and welcome to the next enthralling episode of the perfect grade Bandai Millennium Falcon 1/72 scale build for my very good friends emodels.co.uk, your one-stop shop for all your model making needs. Yes, this video is being made for them. So yes, welcome. It's the next episode 5.5, I think we're on now, something like that. Now, if you remember in previous episodes, we've done most of the building and we've got the cockpit done. Now, I know you didn't see it in the last episode, but I have finished the cockpit and the figures. We finished painting off the cockpit in the previous episode, and unfortunately, as I said at the time, I did try filming painting the minis, the figures. It was a clusterfuck. It wasn't going to happen. I can't paint such tiny things and film them at the same time because of the nature of me having to get really close because I'm an old man. I've got rubbish eyesight. I've got a photograph. I'll pop it up here a bit bigger so you can see better, but yeah, they're now painted and in there. I've got Han and Chewie, and I've got Luke and 3PO in the back, and it all looks fantabulous. I do apologise that I couldn't show you how I painted them. It's just not practical for me to film that, but I hope you don't mind too much. But I've gone ahead and I've put the cockpit in place in situ, and I've even installed the wiringations for the lightage. So here we go. Now, if you remember, this is there appears to be children outside screaming. I hope it's not like the apocalypse or something. It's very warm today. I may talk rubbish because it's really warm. Yes, this is the limited edition kit with the lighting and all the decals. Now, do keep in mind, like I've said before, this is no longer in production. The one you can get now that's still in production doesn't have water slide decals and doesn't have the lighting kit. If you've been looking to get this kit, it's no longer produced. They've stopped making it. They're never going to be releasing this specific kit again. However, eModels have snagged a whole bunch of these. They've managed to find a whole mess of them and they've got them in stock. So this is in stock. If you've been umming and ahhing about getting this specific one, it does have advantages over the regular kit that it comes with water slides, not stickers, which is much better. You don't have to manually paint all the bits and bobs, but it does have all that extra stuff. So if you have been thinking about getting this, get your hands on it. As far as I remember, eModels told me they bought up the remainder of all the stock they could find. There's only so many of these made, and once they're all sold, that's it, they're gone. Or you get gouged on eBay for anyone that sells them for twice the price. So if you've been thinking about it, snap one up. Anyway, yes, if you are unlucky enough to get the one without the lighting kit, or if you're not that enamoured of the lighting kit that comes with it and you want to do your own, here's a reason why you might want to do that. It's a great little kit, but here's a reason. If I turn the lighting on, I'll turn it on first, and then I'll plug it in. If I show you the lighting that comes with the cockpit, the default lighting, it's that. Yes, it's that. So when you put this over the top. Now, obviously, I'm filming with all the lights on here and bright lights, so you can't really see anything. But, I mean, when it goes a little bit dark, it does illuminate the cockpit a tad, but it's minimal. You just get those beams at the back. To make things more interesting, what I could have done, there's a few things for you, options open to you. Keep in mind, I am building this straight out of the box. I'm not doing any extra third-party stuff to this. I'm just building whatever comes in the box. So my options were limited, but you do have a few options here. There are, of course, third-party photo etch cockpit kits, I think. And they'll have little holes in them and things for lighting where fibre optics can come through, or it'll just show lights feeding through, or they may have ways to feed fibre optics into these plastic components. So you can make the whole cockpit nice and lit up. You could do that on this, of course, but it'd be a lot of drilling work and prep. If you don't want to go that involved, what I could have done and what you could do is, instead of putting all the decals on the back wall, just paint over it. To paint it manually by hand, and then scrape off the paint where you want there to be a clear part showing through, and that will be a blinky light. Put some coloured, clear, transparent paint like red or greens or blues over that little bit of scrapey where you've taken the paint off, and you've got a clear light showing through. And you could do that all over the back wall, and you'd have little blinky lights, and it would look pretty good. Or of course, I could have drilled little tiny holes where I want blinky lights to be, and again, you get the same effect. The light shines through. I could put some coloured paint over there, some clear paint, and it would just look like coloured lights. The reason I didn't, for me personally, two reasons. One, it would look weird for me because the back wall would be illuminated, but the side walls wouldn't. because they're just solid plastic, and also the console wouldn't have any lights on it. And also, this is going back to eModels, remember, I don't get to keep this. So when this goes back into their display cabinet, first of all, it'll be down at kind of like shin level in the cupboard probably, or chest level at the most. You're not going to really see inside the cockpit. But also, they're not going to have the lights turned on. This is battery-powered lighting. They're not going to have it wired to the mains because it's going to be in their cabinet in the store. They're never going to turn the lights on, so it doesn't really matter too much for me. If you're building this for yourself, you could go the whole hog and you could, do a lot more effort in the cockpit. You could wire it up to mains rather than use batteries. There's a lot of things you can do. I don't do lighting electricity because I hate it. I'm allergic to it and I'm rubbish at it. So I'll just do whatever the kit gives me and I'll leave it at that. So yes, so that is the cockpit done. So the figures are all done and painted. The next step now is we have to get the exterior part done to get this ready to get painted. So we've got a few bits we need to attach. I also need to address some of these seam lines. Now I've been having a look into this, and I've mentioned before about the seam lines. We have, of course, with the canopy here, we have this line down here, the line here. We have this big seam line there, and we have this little gap here. This reflects on the actual studio model as a panel line, so it's fine. I've been researching and doing a lot of looking into studio model photographs of the different various versions of the Falcon that they made. Here's what I came up with. On most of the filming miniatures, this is an actual panel line. It doesn't need to be filled in. That is actually there on the real thing. This on most of the filming models is also maybe not that intense, but it's there. It's a panel line, and so is this one. This is a panel line on the real filming miniature. This is not. And this, there is an actual line here on the filming model, which is reflected in that change of angle, but that is not there. However, so what that would do, that would leave us, before I say however, that would leave us with this line here, which we need to deal with, and this little bit here. Now, here's the however. This bit we can fill in, no problem. I'll show you that. This bit, there's a ridge there underneath this little gap. That's going to be a right pain in the bum to fill and then sand back to look as clean and crisp as that. So I'm not going to do that. There's always a point when you're doing any kind of filling of gaps. If you're able to fill it and clean it up perfectly and it looks fantastic, then do it. However, if you think that when you fill it in and fill a gap, you're not going to be able to get back to that nice, smooth, crisp edge like down here, sometimes it's not worth it. It's worth just putting up with a gap. Now, on the filming miniatures, like I say, this is just solid, there's no gap. However, I did find a couple of photographs of the Falcon, and it seems to have a little greeble here, like a little square greeble on the side of the cockpit tube. So what I've decided to do is this will fill in, because that shouldn't be there. These we can leave. This, I'm not going to fill it. I'm going to fill this little bit here because I can do that. But I'm going to put a greeble here with plastic card and maybe a little tiny one here. Now, it's not going to be canonically accurate, but it's going to look a lot better with a little plastic greeble there and there, hiding the gap, than it is to try and fill that and then sand it back and keep that nice crisp edge, because it's frankly going to be beyond my sanding and filing skill. It's far too complicated. What I need to do, I need to get these bits on here. We've got the bit down here, and we need to get this glued. What we're going to be using is a couple of things. We are going to first of all be using the Tamiya extra thin glue to glue this together, and I'm going to be using some sprue goo, which is my own custom made filler. And sprue goo is basically Tamiya extra thin with lots and lots and lots of little offcuts, little tiny offcuts of polystyrene sprue from various kits dumped in it, and it makes a big, thick, stodgy, gloopy mess that has, it runs a little bit, but basically it's got to be so thick that it doesn't just drip off the brush. It has to just sort of sit there and not go anywhere, because this is basically liquid polystyrene, which we're going to use to fill these gaps. So let's get that done. So the first thing we're going to do is, I'm going to keep this wire out of the way. First thing we're going to do is quite quickly just glue this in place. We're never going to have to take this apart again. The wiring's all in place. So what I want to do is get myself my extra thin, and quite simply just touch it here and touch it there. Now it's already quite a nice tight fit, so we don't need to worry too much. But this is just to lock everything in place and fill gaps as best we can. So I can hold that. I'm going to take myself some masking tape. I'm going to, quite quickly, because I need to be fairly speedy, is literally take this up. There we go. I think that should be all right. Yeah, that should be fine. Take this up just to keep it gripped. Just for a minute or two. Just so there's some pressure on it. So it'll stay in place. And what I can do while I'm waiting is run glue down this gap here. Again, you don't. This is a push fit kit. You don't need to glue any of this together. As I've said before in other episodes, the only reason I'm doing any gluing on this kit is 100% because it's going back to eModels. It's going to sit in their cabinet, and I cannot assume that at some point they're not going to knock it and bits fall off if it's not glued together, and then they'll panic because they won't know what to do. So yeah, that's why we're gluing this together. I'm just going to hold that there. And hopefully what will happen is a little bit of the glue will splooge out of the gap and fill it a little bit to start with, but not to worry if it doesn't, because that's where the sprue glue comes in. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes, so let me come back in a couple of minutes and we'll take this tape off and we'll do the filling. Back in a moment. Now, I say filling, but we won't actually have to do any filling at all, because the glue we put in there when we glued this together has actually filled any tiny gaps well enough. All we need to do now is get rid of this step here. And this is going to be really easy, because there's no putty or filler. I can go straight in with the sanding. And I'm starting with a metal file. This is the metal file from the Meng starter set, available from emodels.co.uk, your one-stop shop for all your model making needs. Yes, now I'm starting with the metal file because it'll make faster work of this. I'm trying to be as gentle as I can. You can see how I'm curving the angle of the blade to make sure I don't flatten the edge. I want to make sure this curved surface stays curved. So I'm angling it and adjusting the angle as I go. And I'm not putting too much pressure on, I'm being gentle. I don't want to convert this to a mess of scratches and gouges and gashes. So going gently with a fine file gets it done fast, but doesn't make too much of a mess. And we can clean up any little scratches and marks made with the file when we come to the sanding sticks in a moment. So it's just a case of slowly working away on this edge and trying to get it flat, and well, not too flat because it still needs to be curved, but get rid of the step completely as best as we can. Next, once that's been done, it's time to work our way up the grits. I've explained this to you before in different videos. What we do is we start off with the roughest grit possible and slowly work our way up to finer and finer sanding grits to make sure we sand away any imperfections that we've introduced during the process. We started off with a rigid metal file, and now we've moved on to a sanding sponge for three reasons. One, this is more flexible, so it allows us to keep tweaking this little curve. If we've made any flat spots with the file, we can get rid of them here. Also means we can catch any little rough edges that we may have missed with the file, because again, it's not flexible. And last of all, the main purpose of this is because this isn't as rough as the file, this just sands down any imperfections and scratches the file may have introduced. Now, it does introduce scratches of its own, but these are finer and are dealt with at the next step. And of course the next step is to go in with an even finer grit. Now, like I've said many times before, UMP sanding sponges, although it says on the packaging what grit they are, it doesn't say anything on the sponge, so I've got no idea what grit this is. It's a finer grit than the last one, and of course it's a much finer grit than the file. And we're just repeating the step here. The first sanding sponge was to clean up the mess left by the file and to smooth things off. This sponge now is to clean up the mess left by the last sanding sponge because it's finer and smoother, and keep the surface nice and smooth and finish off any rounding that we need to do. And this is now a surface fit for primer and paint. You can still see a hint of the gap, but there's no step anymore, and the bit you can see is just the difference in sort of opacity between the plastic and the plastic that was glued. That will disappear once it's got primer on it. Next, I need to deal with this gap here. Now, this gap, filling this is well beyond my skills. Not filling it, but actually bringing it back to a stepped shape afterwards is well beyond my abilities. I've always said I'm a painter, not a builder. So what I'm going to do is use my weasel powers to weasel out of having to fill it and sand it back, and I'm actually going to get a little bit creative. I'm going to stick a greeble on it to cover it up. Now, remember, I've said this before, if at first you can't fill it, stick a greeble on it. Dead easy. I've got myself some very thin plastic card, and I'm just going to make a couple of little sort of widgets, a couple of doodads, little doohickeys that are just going to sit over the gap and not completely cover it, but just distract the eye enough so that you don't actually notice the little tiny bit of gap that you can still see, and once it's primed and painted you won't even know it's there. Now, I did say before, if you look at the actual full-size Falcon they made for the studio sets, there is a hint in some of the pictures of a greeble in around about this spot, so it may well be kind of sort of canon, maybe, sort of, I think. Get away with it. I can't go any higher than that. A little bit, maybe. I can't. It's not there on the filming miniature, of course, but it works for me. It works in my brain. And all I'm doing is I'm cutting a couple of little bits here to size and sticking them on. It's not really that complicated, to be honest. This is all completely judged by eye. As you no doubt know, if you've been in any of my live streams lately, I don't really do measurements very well. This is probably about, I don't know, 25 millimeters square or something. 6 by 2 feet. It could be a couple of kilometers. I don't do measuring. Now here is something super cool. My very, very dear friend Kenneth, who lives in Australia, made me a couple of pots of different sized rivets. These are just bits of plastic card put through a rivet making tool which makes tiny little dots of plastic, and they are perfect for scale model rivets if you want to add rivets to a model, if you've had to sand some detail away and taken some rivets with it. They're also great for just making a greeble look more interesting, more greebly. Rather than a little square of plastic card, these just add a little bit of detail to it and make it look a bit like it's supposed to be there and wasn't just something I plonked on because I didn't have the skill to fill a gap. I have used little squares of plastic card in other little places around the ship, usually where I've put a big glue thumbprint or I've messed up something and there's a little splodge of glue or the plastic's got a bit grinky and I've had to cover it up. They are a really great way to hide little mistakes while you're assembling a kit. I'm not going to fill these two little gaps here because I suddenly realised there's little gaps all along these two strips and they just look like they're meant to be there, so I've left them. There's no point filling them. Next is time for the photo etch, the last piece of photo etch in this kit, and if you're worried about photo etch, don't be, it's dead easy. First we're going to get the piece off the fret, and I'm just using a pair of old Tamiya decal scissors for that. Some people do prefer to use knives, but I find that if I use a knife I end up bending the piece. This way I get to keep the piece nice and straight. Then I get rid of any little bits of nub, again just using the scissors to get rid of the big nub pieces, and then a little metal file just to get them nice and smooth. This might be quite a tight fit, so I can't afford to have any little nubulations sticking up. A primary concern here is, again, not to go very heavy. I don't want to bend the piece. There's one little plastic component that pokes through this. Now this piece is a bit of a pain. If it had two bits of plastic that went through it and held it in place, you wouldn't need any glue. But there's only this one piece that locks in down here. The top bit is not attached at all. You have to glue it in. Now for gluing metal to plastic, you cannot use anything other than super glue, CA glue, cyanoacrylate, or if you've got some particularly thin epoxy glue that might work, but I would recommend super glue. Normal glues won't work because they can't dissolve metal. For this I'm going to use Zap CA's thin CA glue. I'm using thin because it's much neater, and what I'm using is one of these. It's a filament applicator. Get yourself some of these. They make life so much easier. Rather than trying to get the glue on there with a cocktail stick, you'll see here I can just very carefully squeeze it through the filament applicator and apply it where I need it. You can use thick glue, but there's such fine details on this piece of photo etch. If you start blobbing big chunks of fat super glue on here with a cocktail stick, you're just going to make a mess. So I used to hate using fine super glue because it went everywhere. It was very thin like water, until I got me these little fine applicators, and now I can use it quite happily. Just use it like Tamiya extra thin. Put the piece in place and run the glue into the gap. It may blob, but you can just kind of squidge it with the end of the applicator and it will bed down and settle down, and you'll have an invisible attachment. Once it was able to stay in place by itself, I just went back and put little tiny touches of glue all along the length here and there, just to kind of lock it down in place. And you can see when it's done, nice and neat, because I used that filament applicator. It's not covered in messy glue. Now, you'll see here, I've added something here. It's not canon, it's not real, but I've added this strip of white plastic card across the top. Why have I done that? because I like super glue to glue metal, but I don't trust it an inch. I don't trust that it won't ping off one day. So I've put this piece of plastic card glued over, attached to those two strips at the side, just to lock it in place. So if that glue at the top does fail, it ain't going nowhere. Once all that was done and all the rest of the bits and bobs and the canopy were glued in place, it's time to go in with the primer. Now this is Ammo by MIG white primer. You may notice it's not white because I've added some Ultimate Primer black to it. You can mix and match primers to get different colours. I didn't want to use just a white primer because the colour I'm going to spray over it is just off-white, and it can be quite tricky to see where you've put paint when it's very similar colour to the primer. You can, is that primer? Is that paint? You don't know if you've missed bits, and I've made this mistake before, spraying a Falcon white over white primer. Yeah, I probably missed half the hole with paint and it ended up just being primer. So yeah, always try and get your colours a bit different. Now, I simply added a touch of black here, but you could, for example, add a touch of red or blue or green or whatever colour you want, just a tiny amount, just to tint it away from the white. One thing I would say with the Millennium Falcon is don't prime it black. The original studio model was primed black, but that was then painted with enamel paints, which were quite opaque. You're painting with acrylics. They are quite transparent. If you prime this black and then try and paint it your off-white colour, it's going to be shifted towards the blue. It's going to look cold and grey and take a lot of coats to get a nice warm white colour. You don't want to do that, so I've gone for this grey colour instead. Now I will admit straight out of the gate, this is darker than I planned. I didn't think it would be this dark, but it doesn't end up being a problem because you'll see as it goes along, it works out fine. Now, how to actually apply this primer, I'm using my Neowater 0.35 airbrush here, and I'm using the Ammo primer. The thing to keep in mind, here's the thing, the Ammo by MIG primer, the one-shot primer, and the Ultimate Modeling Products Ultimate Primers are both exactly the same product. They are both Badger Steinal Res relabeled. They're as good as each other, which is why I had no problem mixing them together. They're the same thing. Now this works for whether you're using the Badger, the UMP primer or the Ammo primer. Do not thin them. Never thin a primer, not ever, because it changes the way a primer works. A primer is not a paint. A primer is designed to grip to the plastic, either mechanically or chemically. It's not a paint, it's a primer. So don't thin it because that will change the way it works. The way I apply my primers is similar to the way I apply my paints. This first coat you can see me putting on here is a slapdash, careless, misty coat, just to give a slight coating on the surface so that when I go in with a thicker coat in a moment, that will have something to grip to and not just bare plastic. It's called a key coat, and you just need to get this on quickly, very lightly, misty coat, and then we'll build up the colour on top. When the key coat's done, it's time to go back in with a proper layer of primer now. Now these primers, the Badger, the Ammo and the UMP, are absolutely, utterly idiot proof, which is why I love them, because I'm an idiot. It doesn't care if you put them on in misty coats and build them up, or if you just slap it all on as big, massive, thick coats all in one go. It really doesn't care. However you apply it, it will finish beautifully, and it'll give you a lovely, wonderful, crisp, clear coat of primer that does not obscure all the little tiny details and recesses. It doesn't care how you put it on. I'm blapping it on here. I did it as two slightly thicker coats overall. I went round the whole thing once and then just went back over with another second coat just to make it nice and thick. But this primer really is idiot proof. It doesn't care how it goes on, and you cannot mess it up unless the only way you can mess it up is to literally take the cap off your airbrush and pour it onto the model, and even then it will probably still look all right. it wouldn't. Don't do that. It was a joke. So yeah, I just did a couple of thicker coats now. It looks terrible when it's wet, but as soon as it's dried, it self-levels, it levels off, and it looks fantastic. So just get it on. Now this step is completely unnecessary and just me being overcautious, but I went in with some Ultimate Primer Black and just reinforced some of the light blocking areas here and in the lower hull as well, where all the lighting will be. It's probably unnecessary completely because we've got primer and paint going over the top, but I just like to be extra cautious. Okay, now we can start to add a bit more profesh to our build, make it look a bit more awesome. We're going to go in with some pre-shading using Tamiya's Rubber Black, which, although it says black in the name and it looks black there on the telly screen, it's not actually black. It's a very, very dark grey. Now, if you remember, I explained that I didn't want to prime this model black because that would change the colour that goes on top, the off-white colour we're going to put over the primer. It would tint it towards the blue and make it look cold, and we don't want that. We want it to look warm, and a warm off-white. However, that doesn't mean we can't use a dark colour to emphasise recesses and shadow and depth, and to give the model a much more three-dimensional look. Now, the trick whenever you're making a miniature of something, this is not a realistic technique. If you look at anything in the real world, this is not how things actually look. But when you're making a miniature of something, you have the freedom to exaggerate and overemphasize things, to increase contrast between light and dark in an unrealistic way. Because although it sounds really weird, the way your brain works is, if it sees something that's exaggerated beyond realism, that's a miniature of something, it thinks it looks real. It makes it more convincing. If you made a model of a jet fighter without any pre-shading and just painted it the flat colours like it looks in real life, your brain will be like, that's just a really badly painted model, because it's miniature and it expects certain exaggerations. So what we're doing is we're going to emphasise and exaggerate areas that we want to be a little bit cooler, a little bit colder, and a little bit more in shade. I'm hardly pulling the trigger back at all. I've dropped the pressure down to about 15-16 psi, which is a little low, but I've thinned the paint a little bit more than normal as well, because I want this to be subtle. And what I'm doing is I'm just putting this colour where I want there to be areas of shadow. Now, the trick with pre-shading is it will look like garbage right now at this stage when you're adding it. Don't worry about being neat, don't worry about being precise. For example, if I want to spray it along, say, an edge or a panel line, I might not get it exactly on the edge. I might not follow truly the panel line. It might wibble and wobble and be all over the place. It doesn't really matter. This is just a way for you to pre-install areas that will look a little bit darker. And when the top coat goes over the top, it'll just have a kind of wonderful variation to it. Because if you paint the Falcon with just a base flat coat, it's kind of boring. Like the primer coat there is uniform, it's just flat, there's no depth, there's no change to it, it's just primer colour. That's what it'll look like. It's boring. You want it to have some exaggerated relief, dark and light. Now, you can do it various different ways. You can paint your model and then do the post shading, which is what we're doing here, but you'd add it after the base coat. That requires a lot more skill and careful application. Pre-shading is easier because you do this bit now, you just slap it on, you get it on there willy-nilly, and then you can use your top coat over the top to tweak it and finesse it and make it look fantastic. So all we're doing, going around panel lines, recessed areas like that lip there, that little step. Also on greebles, piles of greebles like here, you can see I'm painting this bit. Because when I do the colour over the top, anything that's in recess, all little bits between the greebles where the paint can't get, will stay in shadow. So it's worth doing lots of this on greebles. You'll see on the hull as well, when you get the little maintenance pits on the top and bottom hull, I'll paint in there quite a lot to make them nice and dark. But that's what I'm doing. And this takes about... It took me about an hour and a half to get the whole ship done. It's dead easy, don't think, just get it on. Delicious coffee. Nice to have a break after all that spraying. Now, sit a spell, children, for your Uncle Fox will teach you something about the original Millennium Falcon studio model. Now, a lot of people get very, very passionate about the colours used when you do a Millennium Falcon. I'm going to tell you something now. I'm not particularly paying too much massive attention to the studio model. I'm not that intensely passionate about getting the exact right colour. I want to get it looking good, but as you remember at the start of this project I said I'm not trying to out and out reproduce the studio miniature. I'm creating a sort of hodgepodge of the studio miniature and in my mind what the ship would look like if it was a real ship and it was flying through space and landing on planets. It's kind of a half and half between studio model and realistically painted. So I'm going to be true and faithful to the original, but not religiously so. So if you're wondering what colour to paint your Falcon, it's not just white. A lot of people just spray it white. It's not white. I'm not sure if it's all of them, and I could have this slightly wrong because I'm doing it from memory all in one take, but from my memory, the original studio model, at least the New Hope Falcon, was painted with a couple of different, well, a few different colours, but the majority of it was painted with 2 Floquil enamel paints, Reefer White and Grime. Now, here in the UK, you've never really been able to get Floquil paints anyway. And they are long out of production, I think, although they may just have started coming back under a different guise. Because most of us can't get Floquil paints, swig of coffee, and I wouldn't want to spray enamels anyway, we're left with various alternatives. Now, there are lots of companies that make paints that look like the Falcon colours, and I've mixed my own colours in the past, and I've had varying degrees of success. I've tried things like Tamiya's AS16 Insignia White, I think it is. Insignia White? Yes, I think it is. It's a rattle cam, and it's not really there. It's white, but you want an off-white, creamy, warm tone. That's what you're looking for. Now, what we're going to do today, I'm going to custom mix my own. Now, this is by no means 100% correct. This is just a method I've used in the past to get a reasonable Falcon colour. I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to make your own. I'm going to need a pot of Tamiya Deck Tan XF55 and 3 pots of Tamiya XF2 Flat White. That's it. These are all the colours we're going to need. And what do we do? Well, we're going to get these colours. We're going to get this coffee moved out of the way, but first I'm going to move some of it into my face. Oh God, that's good. Right, so what we need to do is mix these up. Now, what you could do is just mix all these up. Now, if you're wondering, by the way, the reason I'm doing 3 pots and 1 pot is because it's kind of roughly a 3-to-1 ratio. It might even be a 4-to-1 ratio. I can't quite remember. So I do have more pots of paint here on standby just in case. It's been a while since I've done this. The reason I'm doing it as pot, pot, pot and pot and not just 55 drops of this and 22 drops of that is because the old percentages or drops thing is nonsense and you never get it right. At least if you do a pot, it's 3 of them and 1 of them, and that's as complicated as your maths needs to get. Or yeah, maybe 4 of them. That's a 4-to-1 ratio. There's no hard science here. It's not absolutely hard and scientific. So what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is thin these, because we could mix the paint first and then try and thin it for airbrush, but that's going to be a bit fiddly. Basically, Tamiya paints, handiest way to do it is top up the pot with thinner. It's about right. All you do, add some thinner till it gets to kind of the top of where this edge of the pot is here. Just not to the very top of the pot, just to where the lip of the pot is. It's very rough and ready, but it should be about enough thinner to make it airbrush nicely. Now I'm using here, I'm going to put, before I do that, I'll put these lids on just to be safe. I'm using Ultimate Modelling Products Airbrush Thinner. Available from emodels.co.uk, your one-stop shop for all your model making needs. Other thinners are available. It's just alcohol-based thinner. So we need to get all this combined together. Now I've got myself an old paper cup here, just cut down because I don't need it to be that tall. And this couldn't be simpler. We're just going to mix all these together. So the first thing I'm going to do is take 3 of these white pots. Now here's a handy tip for you. If you're pouring liquids from a silly pot like this into something, get yourself a stick or something flat, as this is especially handy if you're decanting to the cup of an airbrush. If you use an edge, you can use a cocktail stick or whatever you want, but if you pour along an edge, it tends to just focus on that and go down the edge. You don't have to do it here, but just a handy tip I thought I'd show you. It just means, especially when you're decanting things from, say, one of these pots to your airbrush and you haven't got a pipette handy, you'll suddenly find this is very, very handy. It's a good way of controlling. You won't get all the paint dribbling down the side of the pot, or not as much anyway. Right, let me just get some of the paint off there, because that was the wrong end. Because it's also my stirring stick. So that's 1 pot. Now, I don't actually need to use that to do this, because I'm just pouring into a massive, great big cup. There we go. 1, 2, 3. this one. Now I'm using a paper cup here to mix into, but it is like a wax lined or plastic lined waterproof paper cup. If you just use a really crappy paper cup, the paint's just going to soak through it, and that'd be rubbish. So just use a disposable plastic cup of some sort of paper cup or something like that. Anything doesn't really matter if you're going to mix paints. So that's 3 lots of the white. Now let's mix in the tan. This is the deck tan. Give it a bit of a shake, because it does tend to sediment out this one. Now this is where it might go wrong. I can't remember the exact mix I had. So that's just white paint, and white is too bright for what we want. So we'll mix in this deck tan. And what we're looking for, I know my hand's in the way, I do apologise. What we're looking for is a nice warm white. So let's mix this in first of all. Okay, now you're not seeing the actual true colour here, of course, on camera. But it's kind of it's an off-white, and it's hard to explain. It's like a kind of concretey colour. It might be a bit too brown though. I want it to be warm white, but not like brown. So what we'll do is we'll come in with a bit more white. We'll add, I've got more deck tan if I need it. We'll add a bit more, another pot of white, because it might have been 4-1 in my memory. We just want the deck tan to tint the white a little bit. There we go. That's more like it. Now again, do keep in mind you're not seeing exactly the colour that it should be. You're getting a digital camera version otherwise. Now that is the kind of colour I'm looking for. It's a warm off-white. It might seem a little too brown and, you know, a bit weird. But keep in mind, it's going to be going over a grey primer coat anyway. And it might look really dark now, but when it's on its own, it'll look fine. And we can, of course, do things like dry brushing with white, actually proper white, so we can use it. We can go over with more white if we need to. But that's going to be a good base coat to start with. So it's 4 flat whites and 1 deck tan. And I'm quite happy with that colour. That's pretty good colour. So I'm going to get this cleaned up, because what we need to do now is the bit where this can all go wrong. I've got myself some disposable dropper bottles. And all we're going to do, I've got 4, 3 here and 4 if I need them. Hope I've got enough. What we're going to do is we're going to put a crimp in this paper cup. This is why you want a paper cup. Put a crimp in this. And quite simply decant. This is where it gets messy and you can go wrong. So 1, and I hope this is on camera for you. And this will probably be more paint than we actually need anyway, so don't worry too much. But yeah, these are just cheap disposable dropper bottles. There you go. If you use a brand of paint that actually has dropper bottles, then when you finish, it's always a good idea to not just throw the bottles away, but keep the bottles, take the label off, and you've got yourself a nice refillable dropper bottle there that you can fill with other paints. So whenever you finish a pot of paint, a dropper bottle of paint, don't throw it away, clean it out, reuse it. You know, if you use, say, Vallejo paints and stuff that come in dropper bottles, just keep hold of them. Give this a little stirry. Now you might be thinking, again, why have I mixed like 4 pots and 3 pots? Why have I made so much if this is more paint than I'm ever going to need? Bear in mind that I managed to prime the entire Falcon with half a bottle of the primer, which is about twice the size of one of these. Why do I need this much? And this is the important thing when you're mixing your own colours. It's always important to mix more than you think you'll need. I know all you can see is my hand, I do apologise. It's very important to mix absolutely more than you think you will ever need. Okay, there's not much point doing that one. What I'll do is I'll put a bit thinner in here, and I'll just, this can do for touch-ups and stuff. Because the worst thing you can do is take a just-in-time or just-enough approach and mix just enough paint. Because what happens if you are halfway through painting something and you knock your paint over and spill it? You've now no longer got the paint left, but you've mixed a custom colour. Or if you misjudge how much paint you need and you've mixed 1 of these bottles of paint and you need 2 of them because you're suddenly halfway through the model and you're running out. Good luck ever trying to mix the same colour twice. Now with this, the advantage is I've just used 4 of one and 1 of the other. Now, if I was to mix this again, it wouldn't be exactly the same because you obviously get a slightly different amount of paint in each pot. But more or less, if I somehow knocked all these over and ran out, I could quite quickly mix more and it would be pretty much the same colour. If you're mixing things where it's 25 drops of this and 16 drops of that and a touch of that, and let's be honest, when you do mix your own colours, you start off with a set plan, but eventually you're adding little bits here and there and you forget. You'll very rarely, if you've done that, be able to get the same colour again if you have to remix it. So it's always worth mixing more paint than you need. So there we go. There is our Falcon white or off-white colour. Now, it may well be a bit too brown. It may look a bit weird, but we're going to go in thin. We're going to go in multiple mist coats. We're going to build up in the middle. And if we need to later on, we can go in with some white, either dry brushed or airbrushed, just to kind of lighten up some areas. But we'll see how it comes out. It is going to be heavily weathered, remember, so it doesn't really matter too much. So I'll go and get these to one side. I'll get everything out, move the camera around, and we'll go back to the spraying times to get this base colour down. Now, one important thing, I'm not going to just be plastering paint all over the bottom of the model. If you remember, we've done the pre-shading. We're going to build this up slowly, focusing it in the centre of panels and staying away from the edges a bit so you get that shadow of the pre-shade line shining through. You could just go and paint it on straight away, in which case, why did you bother with the pre-shading? So yeah, we're going to be going in, getting this misted over, built up slowly, and get some shading effects. So I'll go and get that ready, and we'll crack on. Okay, so here we go, let's crack on. Now, unusually for me, I'm actually going to show you the whole process from start to finish on this panel. Normally I just do a little bit and talk and cut to the next step, but I want to show you how long this actually takes to do one piece. It's at double speed, so you're not going to be here forever, don't worry. And I will stop talking every now and then until the next thing comes along I have to explain. So if I suddenly stop talking like I'm about to in a second, don't panic, keep watching, I'll be back in a second. Now, what I'm doing here is taking off the crown cap, and there's a few reasons I've done that. First and foremost, because I forgot. Yeah, I forgot before I started spraying. But also, I'm hoping to be able to paint this up with a variation and contrast between highlights in the brighter areas, the open areas, and shading in the recesses and around the greebles. And for that, I need as soft a blend as possible. I need to blend from light to dark. Now, if you've got the crown cap on, the point of the crown cap is to create a vortex of air around the needle that sucks the paint along with the air, aerosolizes it and sprays it out. But it gives you a very crisp, defined spray area. If you take the crown cap off, it actually widens the spray area a bit and softens it. It softens the edges of that spray area and just allows you to have a bit more control. Now, the downside, of course, is you've got the needle sticking out. Just be careful when you're cleaning the paint off the tip because you'll stab yourself. If you need to, handle the brush and move it around, don't stab yourself. It really hurts. And also, you have the risk of dinging the needle tip and bending it, which is an expensive thing to replace. So you do have to be a bit more careful, but it allows you to get closer to the model as well and do more subtle blending. Like I say, the point of this whole step is to blend and carefully shade. And I am going to talk you through what I'm doing. I know I'm kind of not explaining anything right now. So I've taken that crown cap off. Now this is going to be a single take. There is one edit in the middle where I had to change or refill the paint cup. That's it. So you're going to see how this goes on. Now, the point here is to maintain some of the shading. The Falcon is a dirty, filthy, dirty ship. It's a very dirty ship, and I want to have some emphasis. And this is a trick that the guys at ILM used to use. And if you're making a model and you want this kind of dirty, worn look, a real fast way of doing it, because the whole point of filming miniatures was to do it fast. A fast way of doing it is to do what I'm doing here, put some pre-shading down, or if you can, shade it in black, prime it in black first, and then build up your colour over the top to keep some of that shading. What I'm doing here as I'm going along, I'm building up the colour in very thin misty coats. I'm slowly adding colour. I'll get it over the whole piece, and then I'll go over again the whole piece, but then after a couple of goes of that, when I think I've got the shaded areas where I want them, I'll then go back and focus on the centre of panels where I want it to be brighter, where there's no shadow, it's not supposed to be shaded, and I'll build up the paint a bit more intensely, slowly. When you see me wiggling the airbrush in little circles like that, it's because I'm painting in the middle of an area and I want to get the softest blend possible. Sometimes I'm just spraying in straight lines because I want to get paint over the whole area. Sometimes I'm focusing in on the centre of an area that I want to be a highlight, a bright spot. And what you do is basically get the mist coats down, start the colour off, focus some paint in the centre of bits that you want to be bright spots, and then take a second to look at it and then go over with some more misty coats, because your misty coats that are quickly applied over the whole surface, they are what you use to tone down the shade, tone down the shadow. And then the careful circular motions in the center of panels, that's what you use to add the highlights. So you're really kind of balancing between toning down the shade and adding the highlights. If you get the whole thing highlighted to the point where all your little center of the panels are just the right bright shade that you want, but your shadows are still a bit dark, then you just go over the whole thing carelessly with some misty coats to cover everything, and that will slowly tone down those dark areas. But this is the trick, you have to work in misty, slow paint coats. When you're doing the centre of a panel, you can work a bit heavier, but you're still kind of slowly building it up. Circular motions mean you're not getting straight lines, and the misty coats allow you to knock those shadows down. If you go in with heavy coats straight away, you might find you've taken the shadows too far, and now you've just lost all your pre-shading, because you want to keep that pre-shading. But it's just slow, misty coats, build it up slowly. It does take a little bit of practice. After a while, you've built a few models with this kind of pre-shading effect, it becomes instinct. You can do it quickly. The speed I do this build now, this painting job here that you're watching, you might take a little longer to do it if you're not used to covering your pre-shading, but I know what I'm doing, so it's kind of fast for me. Keep in mind as well, when I'm going over heavily greebled areas, like some of these detail areas, I am kind of less focusing in the centres and just doing little like misty coats at sort of 45 degree, 60 degree angles, because I want the paint to catch on top of the greebles, but not necessarily go down into the recesses. So I'm being a bit more targeted with those, like at the top of where my hand is, my left hand there at the top with those greebles at the top. I'm kind of spraying them at flat angles just to pick up the tops. Now I will try and highlight some little greebles within piles of greebles. Like I might have a load of greebling and have one little thing in the middle that I want to make that little square thing stand out, so I can be targeted there. But I will generally tend to try and maintain the shade in the recesses. This is a real good way of doing shading now, and depending on what you want to achieve, it may be that if you get it just right, you don't have to go back and do a wash to put recess shading back in. You might not need to. Depends what you want to achieve, but sometimes this level of shading can be enough to give you that three-dimensional effect, so you don't need to do it later on. It depends on the model and what you want it to look like. And 6 hours later, we are done. Base colour all down. I've done the lower hull as well. It's just not on here because I can't fit everything on the bench. But yes, 6 hours that took, with a gap in the middle to let my compressor cool down for 10 minutes. It was getting a bit explodey, bless it. Yeah, 6 hours it took to get all that done because I was taking my time. It is a slow process, but it is more than worth it. If you just painted this a flat, if you didn't do the pre-shading, you just painted it this flat colour, it would look all right. But by doing what we've done here, by allowing the pre-shading to show through in certain places, it does look a bit stark and obvious, like here, because we're just seeing it as a clean build so far. Once we get the weathering and stuff on there, these like obvious patches will kind of fade in and blend away, and it'll start to look more like a real thing. It just gives it some life, and it does mean as well that you've already pre-weathered some things like little grills and recesses. They've already got a certain amount of darkness to them, so you've saved yourself some weathering work later on. Now, there's a couple of things I need to go through with you. They're very important you keep these things in mind. First of all, as for the colour, unless you are being paid a large amount of money by someone to make an absolutely 100% studio accurate, filming miniature accurate model of the Millennium Falcon, don't put too much thought into the colour. What I mean by that is, I wouldn't just spray it white, because white is boring and cold. Let me find something. This is white. That is white. That is not white. I don't know what colour you're seeing right now, because obviously you're seeing an edited video that's been filmed on a digital camera. It's not going to be accurate. I'm seeing a lovely off-white, ever so slightly warm, taupe, kind of nice warm white colour. And there's actual white. compared. That's my colour balance card. There's actual white compared. You can see a difference there. When you see it like that, I don't know if you can tell, but when I see it like this, I can see how not white it is. When you see it just like this, it looks like white. But you'd be forgiven for looking at that and thinking it's just white, but it's not. It doesn't really matter too much. As long as you're happy with the colour you've got, whether it's, you know, like this and using this sort of, you know, the mix I've just used, or you've got your own specific mix, or using a third-party pre-mixed paint that's supposed to be like Falcon White, or you've actually got, you know, Reefer White and Grime somehow from Floquil. If you live in the US, probably you'll be able to get them if they still exist. However you do it, it doesn't really matter, as long as you use something that's not just white and is shifted towards the warm end of the spectrum. So it's not just a cold blue white. This is why we don't want to prime it black and spray white over the top, because that will give you a cold blue shifted white colour. Everything will be more like these patches here, where it's a bluey tone. It's cold. You want some warmth to it. So don't worry too much about the specific colour. Like I say, if you want an easy time, just follow the mix I've done. 4 white and 1 deck tan. There you go, done. Was it 4? Yeah, 4 and 1. Nice and easy. And have to say, I mixed those 2 and a little bit bottles of paint. I didn't even finish the first bottle. It lasted me ages. So I've mixed so much paint that it was far too much. You will end up making too much paint that you're going to use on the Falcon. But if you've got other Star Wars vehicles, decant that paint and store it. It's the same kind of white you can use on an X-Wing or a Snowspeeder or a B-Wing or a Y-Wing. It's a wonderful colour that I've used on many Star Wars vehicles because it is kind of, for me, to my eye, about the right colour. But don't worry so much. Don't stress it. Don't sweat it. Just make sure it's a slightly warm white, off-white, and go for it. Have fun with it. The second thing I wanted to mention, and this will happen whatever colour scheme you go for. Whenever you do pre-shading, I guarantee this will happen. It happens to me all the time. You will put down, like you watch me paint this back panel here. I painted it carefully. I spent, a good few minutes painting all that up, getting all the bright spots and the low spots and things like that. And I put it to one side and I did the rest of the hull and everything else. And I went downstairs, had a cup of tea. I let my compressor calm down for 10 minutes because it was boiling eggs on it. It was really hot. It's supposed to shut off after 45 minutes. It never does. One day it's going to explode and take my legs off, but hopefully not. Touch wood. Anyway, yes, so I went downstairs, came back upstairs. Oh my God, it looked like a battleship. It was grey. I'm like, what the F? Why it looked like that kind of colour? And I'm like, how has that suddenly changed colour? This happens all the time. When you're painting your first base coat, paint is brighter and less transparent when it's wet. When you're putting the paint on, it's always bright. When it dries and cures, it darkens. Some areas that are transparent become sometimes more transparent, colours underneath show through more, and the light areas can darken down. It's always the way. So what looks like brilliant, bright, bold colour, when you come back later, it'll be darker. Or it could just be that you're so used to looking at it and you've not looked at anything else for a while that when you go and look at some other things and then you come back, like I did with the white there, holding up the white against it, you think, oh, actually, it's not as bright as I thought. It's quite dark. Don't panic. If you do all this painting and you come back an hour later and you suddenly realise it's not really white, it's dark grey, just go back, get your airbrush. You'll see the first time I used my airbrush, I was very carefully going up close, getting all the little circular motions in the middle of the panels. What you do then is you get the same paint again, you get your airbrush and you just go, psh, and you just carelessly work it into the centre of each panel. Just don't be too careless, but don't sit there carefully doing it. It took me 4.5 hours probably to paint the whole thing. It then took me half an hour to go back over each piece and just blap the centre of each panel. All I had to do was do a quick mist coat to tone down some of the dark areas and a quick blap in the centre of each panel just to bring the brightness up. And what I found was, when I did that, I came back, it now looked brighter again. It was just, I hadn't put enough paint on, and you'll do it so many times, you think, especially with whites, you think you've put enough paint on, it looks great, but when you go away and come back and you've seen some white things around the room because you've suddenly looked around the room that you haven't done for 3 hours, it suddenly looks not as bright as it did the first time. So don't be afraid to go back in and just put some more paint in the centre of panels and give it a light misting over the top if you want to blend away some of the dark patches. If you do find like you've got an area like this where you've got a dark patch there and you think it's too dark, just go over and mist the whole section. Mix the whole section. That will brighten the bright areas and it'll lighten the dark areas. Don't be afraid to mist colour over. Don't think about it. Anyway, that's going to do it. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, as always, this has been filmed for my very good friends over at emodels.co.uk, your one-stop shop for all your model making needs. All of them, every single one. Do pop along, pick up whatever you want. This kit, and of course all the stuff I've used, is available from them. This kit is in stock at eModels. Don't forget that. It's now out of print. They no longer make this kit with the water slides and the photo etch. eModels have a stock of them. It might well be the last stock of them in the UK. They think they picked up all the remaining ones in the UK. So if you've been looking to get one of these and you don't want the version with stickers and no lights, get onto eModels and get it ordered, because once they've sold out, there probably won't be any more. There's only so many they made, and they were limited editions, so they've got some in stock. If you want one, get one now while they still exist, before they start going for like 900 quid on eBay when they're all completely sold out. But yes, that's going to do it. So thank you very much for watching. In the next episode, we'll start on the decals, and I'll probably do some live streams for the decals as well, but that's the next step. Decals, we have many decals to do. I like doing decals, yes. So that's the next step. But anyway, take care of yourselves. Go make something awesome like this. It's awesome. Go make something awesome. Go be awesome. You there. Yes, you there. I don't know where the camera is. It's there, isn't it? Go be awesome. And until next time, you know what I'm going to say. Adios, amoebas. Yeah. emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome.